Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Canton, Massachusetts, January 29th, 2022. The kind of winter morning that buries more than just streets. It buries context. It buries clarity. And on that day, it nearly buried the truth. At 6:03 a.m., emergency services responded to a residential address on Fairview Road. The report was short. Unresponsive male, snow-covered lawn. First responders found the body of 46-year-old Boston police officer John O'Keefe lying face-up near the front yard of a home owned by fellow officer Brian Albert. He was unconscious, hypothermic, with signs of blunt trauma to the head. CPR was attempted. Transport to Good Samaritan Medical Center was immediate. It didn't matter. He was pronounced dead on arrival. O'Keefe wasn't just another victim. He was one of them. A 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department. Respected, reliable, dead. By 9 a.m., word spread fast. A police officer found frozen in the snow outside another officer's home. The kind of story that doesn't just ripple, it fractures trust inside law enforcement itself. The woman who discovered him, who made the call, who was first on scene, was Bu.ried, his girlfriend of 2 years. She was panicked, distraught. "Did I hit him?" she reportedly repeated to EMTs and officers, but that wasn't a confession. It wasn't even clear what she meant yet. She told officers she had dropped O'Keefe off at the house around 12:30 a.m. after a night out drinking with friends. He was supposed to crash there. She claimed she waited for him to text that he was inside, but the message never came. Hours passed, no response. She returned to the house with friends at sunrise. That's when she found his body. Initial documentation noted bruising around the eyes, cuts on his arm, and a substantial injury to the back of the head. But there were no drag marks in the snow, no blood trail, no broken glasses or signs of a fight. Just a man, face down near a home full of people, none of whom reported anything unusual. By midday, the case was marked as a suspicious death. For the Norfolk District Attorney's Office, suspicion was an understatement. A Boston cop didn't just die in front of another officer's house without someone noticing. The question wasn't just how O'Keefe died, it was how no one seemed to notice he was dying. Crime scene photos captured the positioning of the body, the condition of the snow, the distance from the house. But evidence wasn't only collected from the scene, it extended to Bu.ried's SUV. Her black Lexus SUV had damage to the right taillight. Officers noted red plastic fragments near the snow. Lab analysts would later compare those to debris collected from the driveway. Toxicology was also standard procedure. Reed submitted to a blood draw. The results showed elevated blood alcohol content, though by then, nearly 12 hours had passed since the night's final drink. O'Keefe's autopsy listed cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head, with contributing factors of hypothermia. But not all wounds aligned with a simple fall, and not all explanations made sense. The bigger concern for law enforcement wasn't just that someone might have hit John O'Keefe. It was the possibility that someone knew and stayed quiet. And the strange thing was, there had been a party. The house where O'Keefe was found wasn't empty that night. At least 5 people were inside. Some were officers, some were family. None said they saw him arrive. At the time of the initial report, Bu.ried wasn't under arrest. She was cooperative. She gave her statement voluntarily, but inconsistencies started to appear quickly. Not just in her timeline, but in her tone. To some, she sounded confused. To others, evasive. Surveillance logs from local bars where the group had gone that evening were pulled. Cell tower pings and GPS data from Red's vehicle were subpoenaed. There were discrepancies, gaps between what she said and where her phone had actually been. Digital forensics teams began working with the Massachusetts State Police. Data extraction from Red's vehicle would later become a central element of the case. But even then, some investigators felt the conclusions came too quickly. The data aligned too cleanly, one source recalled. Sometimes that's the problem. Behind closed doors, the whispers started. Was it vehicular manslaughter? Or was something, or someone, inside that house responsible? The official line was simple. The investigation was ongoing, But internally, the pressure mounted fast. A cop was dead. There was a body, there was trauma, and there was a house full of people who claimed to have seen nothing. By the end of the week, what had begun as a tragedy began to shift into something darker. A full homicide investigation. Not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. The timeline was always going to matter. Not just when John O'Keefe was found, but the final hours he was seen alive. In any suspicious death, the window between visibility and disappearance becomes the tightest funnel of truth. Every piece of evidence is measured against it, and in this case, that window was narrow, and yet still wide enough to lose a man. January 28th, 2022. It was a Friday, and for most people in Canton, it was just another winter night. For John O'Keefe and Karen Reed, it began like any other evening out. Casual drinks, mutual friends, the routine that comes with small-town social circles. By 5:30 p.m., surveillance from C.F. McCarthy's bar showed Karen arriving alone. O'Keefe would join later. The two sat with friends, had dinner, ordered drinks. Footage from inside the bar, later reviewed by detectives, showed nothing out of the ordinary. No conflict, no visible argument. But the night didn't end at that bar. According to multiple witness statements, including from Jennifer McCabe and Matthew McCabe, the group decided to continue drinking elsewhere. They moved to Waterfall Bar and Grill around 9:45 p.m. More drinks were consumed. O'Keefe, by several accounts, appeared tired. Karen appeared intoxicated. By 11:20 p.m., she was reportedly slurring. Still, she drove. They left the bar together in her black 2017 Lexus SUV. From that moment forward, the trail starts to bend. Karen Reed later told police she dropped John off in front of 34 Fairview Road, the home of Brian Albert, around 12:30 a.m. He was supposed to stay the night. He had done so before. She said she watched him walk toward the house, then she left. That was her statement. But it wasn't corroborated by anyone inside. Officers interviewed Albert and his wife Nicole, along with other individuals present that night. All denied seeing O'Keefe enter the home. There was no camera on the door, no swipe card, no alarm record, no direct proof he ever made it inside. Investigators focused on what could be verified. They pulled GPS data from Reed's SUV, retrieved through a search warrant issued on February 2nd. The data revealed a series of short, slow-speed movements near 34 Fairview Road between 12:31 a.m. and 12:36 a.m., including one moment where the car reversed for approximately 21 feet before idling. An accident, a maneuver, or something else? Investigators noted the coordinates didn't align with her claim of dropping him off at the curb. The vehicle appeared to have pulled into the driveway, reversed, and paused. More than once. Even more concerning, a matching timestamp from a Nest doorbell camera at a neighboring home picked up the Lexus's headlights turning into the property. Then came the physical evidence. The following morning, plastic fragments consistent with a Lexus RX series taillight were found in the snow near the body. Lab tests later confirmed they matched Red's vehicle, a fractured rear taillight on her SUV, which she initially claimed was the result of an earlier incident involving a snowbank, drew increased scrutiny. The impact damage was fresh. Investigators concluded the pattern of breakage was consistent with a hard surface, possibly a human body. Digital forensics also retrieved data from Red's iPhone. Her messages from that night included texts sent between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. to both O'Keefe and Jennifer McCabe, expressing confusion and increasing anxiety over O'Keefe's silence. "John's not answering. Did he get inside?" One message read. Later, she asked McCabe to help find him, but those texts raised questions too. If Karen was unaware something had gone wrong, why was she checking so frantically? Was it genuine concern or an early attempt to establish an alibi? At 5:45 a.m., Karen returned to the home with Jennifer and another friend, Brian Higgins. They claimed to be searching for O'Keefe. When they arrived, she allegedly spotted something unusual near the lawn. They approached. That's when she began to scream. The emergency call was placed at 6:03 a.m. Back at the lab, additional forensic analysis revealed a strand of John's hair embedded in the cracked taillight casing. That small detail, less than 3 inches in length, would become a critical piece of the reconstruction. Forensics would later determine it was forcibly lodged there, likely during a high-contact impact. Karen's blood alcohol content at the time of testing was 0.2, but that was roughly 12 hours after the alleged drop-off. Based on forensic pharmacology, a retrograde extrapolation suggested her level at 12:30 a.m. could have ranged between 0.13 and 0.24, depending on body weight, alcohol intake, and metabolism. That placed her well above the legal limit, a detail that would later shape potential charges. The working theory from prosecutors, developed during the early weeks of investigation, rested on 3 points: impaired judgment due to alcohol, a miscalculated vehicle maneuver, and panic. But even within law enforcement circles, not everyone agreed. The sequence of movements, the timing, the absence of witnesses inside the house, they didn't cleanly align. Investigators privately admitted they were navigating uncertainty. The data looked good on paper, one detective later remarked, but the sequence, it didn't feel right. It moved too cleanly for a night that messy. Still, the physical evidence was mounting. Between the GPS path, the broken tail light, and the embedded hair, a narrative was forming, one the defense would later try to fracture. But at this stage, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had begun to view Karen Reed not just as a witness, but as a potential suspect. By the third day of investigation, the question wasn't just how John O'Keefe died. It was who knew, and when. The focus turned from external forensics to internal contradictions. Physical evidence had drawn a map. Now, statements needed to fit that map. They didn't. The Office of the Chief Medical Examiner released its preliminary report on February 3, 2022. John O'Keefe's cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head with contributing hypothermia. Manner: undetermined. He had a 2-inch laceration on the back of his scalp, a contusion above the right eye, and several abrasions on his forearm and wrist. His clothing was intact. There were no defensive wounds. The timeline of injury was estimated between 12:30 and 3:30 a.m., with onset of hypothermia likely beginning within minutes of exposure. The core body temperature at discovery, around 6:03 a.m., was 77 degrees Fahrenheit. The absence of bruising consistent with dragging supported the theory he had remained in that spot, exposed, immobile, for several hours. But what disturbed forensic analysts wasn't just what they saw, it was what they didn't. There was no dirt or gravel pressed into his skin. The yard was clear. There were no tracks, no blood trail, no signs of struggle. His phone was missing. Investigators began reviewing phone records. O'Keefe's iPhone had no outgoing texts or calls after 12:20 a.m. His last known communication was with a colleague confirming weekend plans. The phone never pinged again. Attention shifted to Jennifer McCabe, a close friend of Karen Reed and one of the individuals who accompanied her back to Fairview Road that morning. McCabe had initially told police she had been asleep around 2:09 a.m. and only woke when Karen called in a panic. But phone extraction revealed something different. At 2:27 a.m., McCabe used her iPhone to Google, "How long to die in cold?" This search occurred nearly 4 hours before John's body was found. When confronted, she claimed she'd searched it after finding the body, shaken and confused. But the data didn't support that. The search timestamp was precise. It occurred while she was still at home, before she had returned to Fairview Road. That single query introduced a crack in her credibility and widened the scope of doubt surrounding what happened during those missing hours. Police followed up with a second interview. McCabe offered a revised explanation, saying perhaps she searched it while half asleep, unsure of the timing. She maintained she had no memory of doing it earlier, but digital forensic analysts confirmed the search occurred from her home IP address. Investigators also reviewed call logs. Between 12:45 a.m. and 4:01 a.m., McCabe received 2 calls from Karen Reed, each under 1 minute. No emergency services were contacted. No other attempts to call John were logged after 1:00 a.m. At this stage, police began to suspect that key individuals may have had knowledge of the incident earlier than they claimed. A formal statement was taken from Brian Higgins, another friend present that morning, who claimed he was just helping Karen look. His timeline, however, also showed gaps. The prosecution's case would later suggest that digital inconsistency, particularly around McCabe's internet history, introduced the possibility of awareness prior to discovery. But defense attorneys argued that search history alone does not prove intent or knowledge of a crime. Still, the question lingered. Why would anyone be researching death by exposure hours before a body was supposedly discovered? Simultaneously, forensic evidence from Karen Reed's vehicle remained under analysis. A second sweep revealed biological material, including a partial DNA sample on the rear bumper, later confirmed to contain a mixture consistent with O'Keefe's profile. However, it was degraded. Analysts noted the sample lacked enough intact cells for definitive conclusions. Prosecutors acknowledged the limits of the material, but added it to the growing pool of circumstantial data. Behind closed doors, the lead investigator recorded in his notes, "Too many gaps, too many overlaps. Everyone remembers just enough to protect themselves." Canton was no longer just the backdrop to a suspicious death. It was a town where silence and timing had become its own form of obstruction. For the detectives piecing together this case, the challenge wasn't finding evidence. It was sorting through statements that shifted with every new discovery. By early February 2022, internal pressure inside the Norfolk County law enforcement chain wasn't just building. It was visible. The death of a Boston police officer on another officer's lawn had ignited scrutiny that extended beyond forensics. It reached into departmental relationships, discretionary decisions, and most critically, what wasn't done in the hours following John O'Keefe's death. A search warrant was never issued for the interior of 34 Fairview Road, the house where multiple off-duty officers and their family members had gathered the night John died. Despite the body being found just outside the home, and despite reports of a party inside involving alcohol, no officer who entered the property that morning initiated an interior sweep. No rooms were secured, no photographs of the inside were taken, no statements were collected from all individuals present. The reason given, it was not initially classified as a crime scene. By protocol, this wasn't standard. When an individual is found deceased from suspected trauma, and especially when the victim is a law enforcement officer, the surroundings are typically treated as a protected zone. That didn't happen here. Later, investigators from the Massachusetts State Police Detectives Unit would confirm that only the outdoor area was preserved. Patrol logs showed that the responding officers on scene deferred to then-lead investigator Michael Proctor, who stated there was no probable cause to enter the home without consent or a warrant. None was requested, but the hesitation to search the Albert residence wasn't the only deviation. Proctor, who had known several of the individuals present at the gathering, including one off-duty officer and a relative of the homeowner, took the lead in drafting the first incident reports. In these documents, no mention was made of the party. No reference was given to potential witnesses inside. The reports were later amended after journalists began asking questions about who was at the house that night. By mid-February, prosecutors issued subpoenas for cell phones from multiple individuals believed to be present that night, including Brian and Nicole Albert. Compliance was partial. Some phones were turned over voluntarily. Others were reportedly reset prior to examination. This prompted concerns within the DA's office, though no obstruction charges were filed. At this point, the case began to divide not only law enforcement teams, but the public. Local news coverage began digging into inconsistencies. Why hadn't the house been searched? Why was the lead investigator texting inflammatory remarks about the suspect? Internal communication logs later revealed Proctor had sent text messages to colleagues referring to Karen Reed as guilty as F. Tonner and stating she would fry. These messages were discovered through a public records request in early 2023. In response, defense attorneys filed motions to suppress all evidence Proctor had directly handled. The judge allowed partial review, but did not disqualify the entire investigation. Still, the credibility damage had been done. The case file began to carry not just forensic weight, but a political one. This fracture had real-world consequences. By March 2023, a formal complaint was filed against Proctor by Reed's legal team. The complaint alleged bias, procedural failures, and mishandling of evidence, specifically his failure to preserve key digital logs and to initiate immediate forensic sweeps of all relevant locations. Internally, several state troopers raised concern that the investigation was being directed with pre-assumed guilt rather than neutral examination. A supervisor later told the court under oath that he had flagged multiple gaps in the chain of custody relating to digital evidence. But what made these decisions more consequential was the increasing likelihood that someone inside 34 Fairview had known or seen more than they admitted. By this stage, multiple witnesses had either changed their original timelines or declined to provide supplemental interviews. When pressed, one individual invoked the Fifth Amendment. Another claimed they had too much to drink to remember clearly. The narrative, once centered on forensic evidence from a vehicle, was now weighed down by questions about institutional discretion. And beneath that was a larger issue, the balance between justice and loyalty. In towns like Canton, where police families, prosecutors, and community leaders often overlap, the ripple of one dead officer doesn't end at the curb. It moves through department politics, silence, and the optics of betrayal. Forensic evidence should lead a case. But in the O'Keefe investigation, what wasn't collected and who wasn't questioned became just as important as the data itself. By March 2022, the case had moved past witness statements and procedural disputes. Now it rested heavily on physics and what the human body tells investigators when words fall short. If John O'Keefe was struck by a vehicle, as the prosecution believed, then measurable signs of that impact had to exist. The challenge was proving whether those signs aligned with Karen Redd's Lexus or pointed elsewhere. At the Massachusetts State Police Crime Lab, the taillight fragments recovered from the snow near John's body were subjected to comparative fracture analysis. These red plastic shards matched the broken rear, passenger side taillight on Redd's SUV. Technicians verified the fit using a digital model. The breakage angles lined up. To the prosecution, this confirmed their narrative. The car reversed into O'Keefe, and the damage was caused in that moment. But impact alone wasn't enough. The case needed more than matching debris. Investigators turned to biomechanical modeling, a forensic reconstruction technique used to simulate impact forces on the human body. Using photographs from the scene, autopsy measurements, vehicle specs, and environmental data, temperature, snow density, surface traction, analysts attempted to recreate what a low-speed collision would do to a standing adult male of O'Keefe's size and height. The results weren't definitive. One model showed that a vehicle reversing at under 5 mph could cause non-lethal blunt trauma consistent with O'Keefe's injuries, but only if the point of contact was the rear corner of the vehicle, and only if he fell awkwardly. Another model, introduced later by the defense's forensic expert, suggested that the skull fracture observed was more consistent with an angular blow from a vertical object, not horizontal vehicular impact. The prosecution relied on forensic photogrammetry, comparing spatial data from the cracked taillight to the position of O'Keefe's injuries, to argue that the alignment was plausible, but they couldn't replicate the precise orientation of the body at time of impact. The snow had been partially disturbed by first responders, and ambient temperature had reduced blood pooling visibility. No skid marks, no blood spatter, and no hard bruising patterns were captured at the scene. What emerged was a forensic stalemate, two sides interpreting the same science with different conclusions. To add complexity, a test performed on Reed's Lexus revealed an onboard system that recorded limited telemetry. It did not function as a full black box, but it retained timestamps of when reverse gear had been engaged. On the night in question, reverse was activated multiple times between 12:31 and 12:36 a.m. near 34 Fairview Road. There was no indication of sudden acceleration, but the stop-start pattern matched the movement shown on GPS. It suggested uncertainty, hesitation, possibly searching, but uncertainty isn't intent. And in a homicide case, inference must be backed by measurable, testable proof. That threshold remained elusive. Both sides sought to interpret the same mechanical data: reverse patterns, damage angles, and body trauma. But even in controlled reconstructions, experts failed to create a consistent injury set that matched everything found on John's body, particularly the absence of scraping injuries or tire marks. That gap became the opening for doubt. For every inch of glass fitted back into place, there remained a wider hole in the physical sequence of events. In an ordinary case, this might have been enough to walk away from prosecution, but this case was already beyond ordinary. And when the cause of death sits between two possible truths, the weight often shifts to the courtroom, not the lab. By the second half of 2023, the forensic reports and witness inconsistencies were no longer just part of the court file. They were headlines. The case of John O'Keefe's death had shifted from a criminal investigation into a public referendum on police transparency and prosecutorial conduct. And for the first time, internal doubts were no longer whispered behind closed doors. They were recorded, reported, and eventually echoed on national television. The integrity of the investigation had already taken a hit with the exposure of text messages from lead investigator Michael Proctor. In those texts, later verified through subpoena, Proctor described Karen Red with slurs and declared her guilt before charges were filed. He joked about the case. He referred to her family members with demeaning language. What should have remained confidential evidence handling logs were now being re-examined as signs of targeted bias. The fallout was immediate. Proctor was pulled from active casework. The Massachusetts State Police initiated an internal review. It wasn't disciplinary, not yet, but it was enough to damage public trust. The defense team filed motions challenging the admissibility of every piece of evidence Proctor had touched. But the blowback didn't end in the courtroom. Outside, demonstrations formed on both sides. Supporters of Karen Reed, many wearing pink as a symbolic contrast to the blue worn by law enforcement, gathered regularly outside the courthouse. Their signs didn't just call for her acquittal, they accused the system of staging a cover-up. On the other side were quiet but steady groups of officers and families who stood behind the original prosecution. To them, Red was responsible, and this was a distraction from a lost colleague. Community trust began to fracture. In small towns like Canton, public opinion doesn't stay online. It moves through town halls, school boards, even neighborhood gatherings. People were no longer debating what happened. They were choosing sides over who they believed, regardless of evidence. What intensified the divide was the emergence of testimony from a law enforcement officer who had worked peripherally on the case and filed a confidential memorandum in September 2023. In it, he claimed that he had flagged inconsistencies early in the investigation, particularly around the decision not to search the Albert residence, but was told to stand down. The memo also referenced an incident in which digital evidence logs were reconstructed to cover chain of custody gaps, including GPS backup files and iPhone extraction metadata. Though the memorandum was later partially redacted, its core message remained. The internal handling of this case was not clean. By early 2024, local media had begun calling the case not just a homicide investigation, but a test of institutional accountability. Several op-eds in major publications questioned whether law enforcement in Massachusetts could credibly investigate one of its own. Cable coverage picked up, with commentators describing the situation as systemic friction between public narrative and internal protection. And yet, with all this tension, no arrests were made beyond Karen Red. No other suspects were publicly named. No officer present at the party was disciplined. The case continued on a single charge against a single person. For jurors eventually called to serve, it was no longer possible to view this case in isolation. By the time jury selection began in the summer of 2024, every potential panelist had heard of the case. Most had seen coverage. A few admitted to reading court documents posted by supporters online. Many were dismissed. What remained was a jury seated under extreme scrutiny, both legally and socially. The courtroom was no longer just a legal venue. It had become a stage. Cameras were banned, but commentary flowed in real time. For the legal system, this was the moment where the internal tension reached its peak. The courtroom would carry not just the burden of proof, but the burden of public credibility. And that's where the case stood. One woman indicted, one man dead, one town split, and a system forced to either justify its process or reveal its cracks. On June 24, 2024, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts formally began its case against Karen Red. The venue, Norfolk Superior Court in Dedham. Security was tightened. Jury instructions were strict. There were no cameras, but every seat in the gallery was filled. Outside, crowds had already formed, some holding pink signs, others in quiet police blues. But inside, the rules were different. This was no longer about public opinion. It was about evidence, sequence, and burden of proof. The prosecution opened with their core theory: Karen Red, intoxicated, backed into her boyfriend in a fit of confusion or frustration and left him to die in sub-freezing temperatures. They framed the case as a tragic combination of alcohol, poor judgment, and a failure to act. Their strategy leaned heavily on physical evidence, the shattered taillight, GPS data, and forensic modeling. Surveillance footage showed the Lexus moving toward 34 Fairview Road. Reverse gear was engaged several times between 12:31 and 12:36 a.m. Prosecutors presented lab findings that confirmed red plastic shards recovered at the scene matched Reed's taillight. The Commonwealth's expert, a state forensic reconstructionist, testified that the damage to the SUV and the location of John O'Keefe's injuries were consistent with a low-speed vehicular impact. He acknowledged that not all variables could be replicated, but insisted the match was plausible. Then came the messages. Text logs from Red's phone, including those sent to Jennifer McCabe in the early morning hours, were introduced to establish intent. "John's not answering," she had written. "Should I go back?" Prosecutors emphasized the time gap between those messages and the actual discovery of the body. The suggestion, Reed had known something had gone wrong, but delayed seeking help. But as the trial moved into its second week, the defense began dismantling the state's narrative piece by piece. They focused first on the limitations of the forensic reconstruction. The defense's own expert testified that O'Keefe's injuries, specifically the skull fracture, were inconsistent with the known height and angle of Red's SUV taillight. He argued the force and shape of the wound suggested a strike from a vertical object, not horizontal vehicle impact. They then turned to the timeline. The 2:27 a.m. Google search, "How long to die in cold?" found on Jennifer McCabe's phone. The prosecution claimed it occurred after the body was discovered, but digital forensic analysts for the defense established it was executed hours before the 911 call. Cross-examination of McCabe revealed shifting explanations. She stated she couldn't remember searching it earlier. Additional inconsistencies emerged from other witnesses. Several individuals present at the party in the Albert residence that night declined to testify. Others claimed not to recall if John had entered the home. No internal search had been conducted, no cameras reviewed from inside the house. The defense argued that law enforcement had failed to investigate any scenario outside of Reed's culpability. Then came the text from Michael Proctor, the original lead investigator. In a surprising pretrial ruling, the court allowed limited references to be used during cross-examination. Though most of the language was withheld from the jury, the defense implied that the investigation had been shaped by bias from the outset. As the trial moved into its third week, jury focus visibly shifted. Notes slowed, eye contact faded. Some looked exhausted. The evidence wasn't leading in a straight line. It diverged. And the prosecution's closing argument, while structured, failed to definitively answer how Red's SUV alone could account for O'Keefe's injuries and the absence of hard contact patterns on his clothing. The defense, in contrast, emphasized doubt. They argued that the lack of biological transfer, the absence of definitive impact modeling, and the incomplete search of the home all pointed to a case rushed to judgment. Deliberations began July 15, 2024. After 4 days, the jury sent a note to the judge. They were deadlocked. Despite extended instructions and further review of key exhibits, the impasse held. On July 18th, the judge declared a mistrial. No verdict, no closure. Outside the courthouse, reactions were immediate. Reed's supporters called it a step toward justice. O'Keefe's family issued a brief statement, expressing heartbreak but reiterating trust in the system. The DA announced plans for retrial within hours. But within the legal community, the mistrial wasn't seen as indecision. It was seen as a fracture, a jury unable to reconcile conflicting science, inconsistent witnesses, and the undercurrent of institutional failure. Trials are supposed to reveal the truth. This one revealed only how far apart two versions of the truth had become. By April 2025, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts returned to court, again accusing Karen Reed of murdering Boston police officer John O'Keefe. The retrial, ordered after a mistrial the year before, wasn't simply a repeat of the original case. It was a recalibration, same charges, same victim. But the temperature inside and outside the courtroom had changed. The state adjusted its approach. No theatrics, no emotional appeals. Prosecutors focused squarely on digital evidence and forensic results, GPS coordinates, vehicle telematics, and lab-confirmed taillight fragments. Their opening statement avoided character claims. Instead, they told the jury this case was about reconstruction, of movement, of timing, of fatal decisions made in seconds. Bu.ried's defense team arrived more aggressive than before. This time, they led with bias. They revisited every procedural flaw from the original investigation. The failure to search the home, the compromised chain of custody, and the inflammatory text messages from now-suspended trooper Michael Proctor. They positioned their case around structural breakdown, not just what the state alleged Red did, but how narrowly they had chosen to see what was possible. Both sides knew the science hadn't changed. The crash modeling was still inconclusive. The hair found on the taillight was still partially degraded. The injuries still didn't perfectly match any single cause. There was no video of the moment of death. The absence of certainty now stood at the center of both arguments. And the jury, 12 new individuals under public spotlight, had to weigh incomplete science against incomplete truth. One significant addition to the retrial was courtroom management. The judge imposed stricter controls, no social media updates during proceedings, no public commentary from attorneys, and no community activists speaking within 50 feet of the building. What happened inside was to remain inside. Testimony resumed from key figures: Jennifer McCabe, Brian Higgins, and forensic analysts. McCabe was pressed again about the 2:27 a.m. Google search for how long to die in cold. The defense argued that search, made hours before the body was discovered, shattered the official timeline. McCabe responded with vague memory, citing panic and fatigue. The jury was left to interpret intent from silence in technical timestamps. On the final day of testimony, both sides rested. Closing arguments didn't offer surprise. The prosecution asked the jury to connect the fragments: digital movement, forensic match, and failure to render aid. The defense asked them to see the larger whole in the case: lack of motive, inconsistencies, investigative shortcuts, and the state's singular focus on Red despite a house full of others. The jury was charged and sequestered. Deliberations began June 14, 2025. By June 17, the date of this writing, they remain in progress. No verdict has been reached. The weight of their decision, guilty or not, hangs over a town already divided, a family still grieving, and a suspect still waiting under surveillance. What makes this case different isn't just the forensic ambiguity, it's how clearly it exposed institutional fatigue. Systems are built to process evidence, not to reconsider their own assumptions. Once an early theory calcifies, it takes enormous force to re-examine what might have been missed. In Bu.ried's case, questions weren't just asked in court. They were asked in the streets, on radio, and public forums. Was justice being served or just followed procedurally? For the O'Keefe family, the lack of resolution means grief with no closure. They've stood silently throughout, rarely speaking to press, refusing to engage with either faction in the public discourse. Their son, their brother, their friend is dead. And more than 3 years later, no one has been convicted. And for Reed, whether she walks free or is found guilty, her life, professionally, personally, and psychologically, has been transformed by accusation. In high-profile cases like this, the verdict doesn't erase what the process has already done. So where does it leave us? This case highlights the fragility of trust in both directions, the public's trust in prosecutors, and the justice system's trust in its own objectivity. It reminds us that evidence must be examined, but so must the decisions about what we choose to examine and what we don't. Not every case ends in truth. Some end in impasse. Others remain suspended between competing narratives, with each side convinced they see what the other refuses to acknowledge. As of June 17, 2025, the case of Commonwealth versus Bu.ried remains legally unresolved, but its consequences on investigative ethics, on public confidence, and on the meaning of accountability are already written. And sometimes that's the part justice systems aren't built to measure. This case reminded me that justice isn't always a straight line. Sometimes the truth gets tangled in bias, pressure, and flawed processes. And it's on all of us to keep asking questions. If there's one thing I've learned through telling this story, it's that silence can cost lives, but so can assumptions. Speak up, stay informed, and never forget that accountability begins long before the courtroom. Have you ever doubted what you were told because something just didn't sit right? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from? And how does this case resonate with your experience of justice? If this story moved you or sparked reflection, hit subscribe so you won't miss what's coming next. And if it didn't, tell me why. I want to hear your perspective too.